The cornfields breathed with heat, crickets chorused their endless dusk song, while a purple haze lingered over the horizon. It was August in rural Kentucky, and the sky hung heavy, swollen with something unseen. A silence curled beneath the wind, not the absence of sound, but the presence of waiting. Somewhere above the flat fields and rusted fences, a seam in the world was beginning to unravel. The Sutton farmhouse, squat and weather-worn, stood like a tooth in the gums of the land. It was an ordinary place, and a kitchen with linoleum floors, a porch sagging with age, children asleep in the back, a family gathered for supper. But on this night, the ordinary had grown thin. A rift had opened, and something had stepped through. It began with a flash, green and white, silent and slow, arcing across the sky like a wound opening in reverse. Then, the barking of a dog, frantic and unplaceable. Then footsteps on gravel, a shout, the slamming of a screen door. Billy Ray Taylor came running, eyes wide, pointing upward with trembling hands. He said the air had split. He said he saw something land behind the tree line. The others laughed, a tension in their throats. This was farm country. The air was always full of tales, but Billy Ray didn't blink. His voice quivered, and his knuckles were white around the shotgun. That was enough. A few of the men grabbed their own weapons. Not because they believed, not yet, but because belief wasn't required when you lived this close to the dark. They walked toward the woods, the air thick with gnats and dread. It was darker than it should have been. The moon was out, but the sky had gone strange. There were no stars, only a deep purple glow, pulsing at the edges of their vision. When they reached the clearing, the earth smelled burned. The grass was flattened in a perfect circle, too smooth for a tractor, too clean for a crash. And then something moved in the trees. What they saw that night would fracture their lives. A creature, small, pale, with limbs too long and eyes too large, emerged from the brush. Its skin shimmered like mercury. Its ears, pointed and bat-like, twitched toward the sounds of their breath. It floated more than walked, hovering just inches above the ground. The men screamed. The creature tilted its head in a slow mechanical motion, curious, almost tender, and took a step forward. The shot rang out. Bark exploded from the trunk behind the creature. It didn't flinch. They ran. Back at the house, the women were already tense, the children waking, the night pressing in. The men slammed the doors, bolted the windows, lit every lamp. The creatures, now there were more than one, began to appear. At the windows, at the roofline, peeking over the fence, no sound, no words, only those glowing eyes and clawed fingers tapping gently on the glass. It was not an attack, it was a visitation. The family was being watched. Panic pulsed through the rooms like a fever. The men fired again and again, but nothing bled. Every shot rang out into a night that refused to echo. The bullets passed through something that did not exist on their terms. And when the guns clicked empty, the silence grew deeper. They began to pray, some aloud, some only in breath, the kind of praying that forgets words and turns to rhythm, to the rocking motion of a soul trying to calm itself against something too large to name. And above them, in the high places of the dark, the sky seemed to pulse. Something was here that did not belong. Not just in Hopkinsville, not just in Kentucky, but in the whole human frame of what is real and what is not. Time bent, thought thinned, the house became a vessel, not of protection, but of revelation. The night itself had become a question, and the family inside was waiting for an answer. But the night had no answers, only mirrors. In the flickering yellow light of oil lamps, the Suttons saw not just each other, but distorted versions of themselves, frightened, fragile, armed with weapons too small for what pressed against the thin skin of their world. Time became viscous. Seconds slowed. The ticking of the old kitchen clock no longer marked minutes. It marked something else entirely. Each tick was a distant drumbeat from a deeper place. The children huddled behind furniture, eyes wide, watching their parents transform. The men were sweating, eyes darting, hands trembling despite their training. The women whispered scripture, half-remembered fragments spilling from mouths gone dry. They spoke of angels and battles, of blood in the lamb's mouth and beasts with shining eyes. But the stories didn't help. Not now, because what they faced didn't belong to their Bible, at least not the version they'd ever heard preached. Outside, the air thickened. It was as if the world itself had taken a breath and refused to let it go. The goblins, if that's what they were, moved without urgency. They did not scream or claw, they simply appeared, peeking in windows, clinging to gutters, crouching near the well, as if watching animals in a cage, studying them for reasons no one inside could guess. A scraping sound came from the roof. A shadow passed across the window, like a bird but slower, heavier, then a thump in the attic, deliberate, not like falling debris, but like a step. The family screamed. The men fired into the ceiling, plaster raining down like snow, but again, no cries, no blood, only silence, silence and that endless watching. It was then that Lucky Sutton saw it up close. Just beyond the screen door, one of the beings hovered inches above the porch boards, its eyes glowing like coals behind wet silver. It reached toward the screen, slowly, gently, with a hand like a bundle of wires, long fingers ending in tiny claws. Lucky shot point blank. The creature flipped backwards without sound, as if yanked by invisible strings, then vanished into the dark. For a moment, the house held its breath. The children stopped crying. The men lowered their weapons, and in that breath, that still and sacred instant, the deeper fear crept in. What if the creatures were not here to harm them? What if harm was never the point? Because beneath the fear, beneath the gunpowder and shattered glass, something else was beginning to surface. Shame, not for the violence, but for the realization that they had not been attacked, only observed, as if judged, as if the eyes staring in from the dark were not foreign, but familiar. Not aliens from beyond the stars, but something worse. Witnesses. Witnesses to a secret the family had not wanted seen. The clock ticked again, the wind shifted, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, the visitation ceased. One moment, the beings clung to the eaves and watched from the well. The next, they were gone, no burst of light, no departure, just absence, an aching, impossible silence. The family waited, hours passing like years. They did not sleep, they did not speak, they only listened. And then finally the sky began to lighten. The first threads of dawn unravelled the night, and the ordinary world crept back in. The chickens stirred, the dog whined, and the stars, for the first time in hours, returned to their rightful places. But the house was not the same. The people inside were not the same. Something had entered, not just the property, but their minds. The guns were still loaded, the windows still shattered, but the threat was gone. Only the questions remained. They stepped outside as the sun crested the treetops and saw nothing but dew and ash, the grass scorched, the porch pockmarked with buckshot, but no blood, no tracks, no sign that anything had happened, except for the smell in the air, metallic electric, like the sky had cracked open and leaked. And still the question pulsed behind their ribs. What if harm was never the point? That question echoed louder than gunfire. It rang in their bones, in the hollow between heartbeat and breath. As the morning sun filtered through trees that no longer felt familiar, the family stood scattered around the yard, dazed, as if waking from a collective fever dream. But it hadn't been a dream. The bullet holes, the broken glass, the ache in their shoulders from gripping rifles too long, these were real. And yet the absence of proof made everything unreal. Deputies arrived after sunrise, summoned by a breathless drive into town, and a story that wouldn't stop unravelling. The lawmen stepped from their cars with sceptical eyes, their boots crunching across blackened grass. They found no creatures, no spacecraft, no trace of anything beyond hysteria and spent shells. But the Suttons' terror was not performative. It was the deep-set kind, the kind that lingers in the eyes and trembles beneath silence. They told their story again and again, voices cracking under repetition. Each retelling sharpened the edges of their memory until it felt carved in stone. The creatures, the glowing eyes, the hovering limbs, the unearthly calm, the scrutiny, the waiting. What unsettled the deputies most wasn't the story itself, but the conviction behind it. These were not fanciful people. They were farmers, labourers, churchgoers. They knew the feel of real threats, floods, debts, broken machinery. But this was different. This was not survival instinct. This was myth taking root in real time. And still, no one could answer the most crucial question. Why? Why this house, this family, this night? The psychologists who would later review the case would call it a textbook encounter with unknown stimuli under stress. They'd point to isolation, rural superstition, and the tensions of the Cold War era. But those theories were written from far away, behind desks, in cities where the stars are drowned by streetlights. In Hopkinsville, people knew better. They whispered other things. They said the sky had eyes and that it looks down on those who forget themselves. Because the real mystery was not what visited the Suttons that night, but what it revealed. For under every layer of fear, there was something older, something deeper, a mirror held up to the American psyche, a vision of armed innocence, defending itself not against violence, but against reflection. The goblins, if we still call them that, never attacked. They didn't force their way in. They didn't harm a soul, they simply arrived and watched. And in doing so, they drew out something monstrous, not from the sky, but from within the house. What the family saw in those great, unblinking eyes was not a predator, but a witness. Not a threat, but a reckoning. The real terror was not the unknown. It was being seen. Because being seen means nothing can stay hidden. Not the unspoken resentments. Not the buried guilt. Not the lingering wounds passed from parent to child, like antique furniture. All of it surfaced under that starless sky. The weight of old violences, inherited and inflicted. The house, long after the goblins vanished, remained filled with that unbearable visibility. And visibility is its own kind of haunting. The Suttons, in the weeks that followed, began to fray. Some left the farm, some refused to speak of it ever again. Others told the story more and more, as if by repeating it, they could shape it into something safe, something with an ending. But it never really ended, because it was never just about that night. It was about the wound that opened when the sky split, the kind of wound that doesn't bleed but watches. And sometimes, watching is worse than bleeding. The kind of wound that doesn't bleed but watches. And in Hopkinsville, wounds like that never quite close. They linger beneath fresh paint, behind curtained windows, inside eyes that flinch too easily, at headlights in the dark. The Sutton family became a ghost story before they ever left the house. Not because of what they claimed to see, but because of what their story exposed. A story that began to echo far beyond their porch. Within days, the newspapers arrived, reporters with cameras and notebooks, leaning in with the hunger of men who fed on the strangeness of others. They didn't come to understand, they came to consume. And what they consumed, they twisted. Green men terrorize farmhouse. Backwoods family claims alien attack. Little goblins invade Kentucky. The headlines mocked, minimized, transformed. The watchers in the dark became cartoonish invaders, punchlines in tabloid pulp. The details that mattered, the silence, the stillness, the fact that nothing was taken or harmed, were lost, replaced by spectacle. Fiction. A mirror cracked deliberately, so no one would have to look too closely at the truth it once held. But the town remembered. They remembered the way the air changed that night, the way dogs refused to go near the farm for days, the way the ground in the clearing stayed scorched even after the rain. They remembered how the children had changed, quieter, paler, eyes darting to corners, how the men had stopped looking each other in the eye. Some things cannot be undone by ridicule, especially when the ridicule hides fear. Because what if the Suttons weren't crazy? What if they were just chosen? Not chosen in the sense of favour, but selection. A point of contact between two truths, the one we tell ourselves and the one that watches when we lie. And if that's the case, then what does it mean to be chosen, to be seen by something that does not blink, to be mapped like a constellation of guilt, fear, memory, to have your entire life held up to a light that makes no judgments, but also offers no mercy? The Suttons began to unravel beneath that weight, not because they had been attacked, but because they had been exposed. Lucky drank more. Vera took to prayer with a desperation that bordered on fever. The children stopped playing outside. The house grew silent, not empty, just quiet in a way that suggests something is listening. The local pastor, when pressed, said only this: "Sometimes we are confronted not by demons or angels, but by truths in masks, and we do not always know which truths are meant for us." The goblins, or whatever they were, never returned, but their absence became a presence of its own. Their memory occupied space like dust in a locked room, and with every year that passed, the story was told less in facts and more in tones. A story passed in lowered voices and warnings to children not to wander too far from home after dark, because the night, once torn, never mends entirely. Even now, when the moon rises over the cornfields and the wind carries too much silence, something stirs beneath the soil. Not a creature, but a question. A question that takes root in the hearts of those who still remember. What if the goblins were not visitors at all? What if they were memories, not of the past, but of a future we refuse to see? This idea took root not in science nor in faith, but in the liminal space where both dissolve, a future that arrives not with invention, but remembrance. As if what came to Hopkinsville that night wasn't new, but ancient, a loop returning, a cycle awakening in the bones of a land too old to forget. The goblins, then, were not aliens in the foreign sense, but natives of a different kind of time. And what does it mean to witness your own future before you're ready to become it? For the Suttons, it meant fracture. They were no longer just a family. They had become a site, a point of convergence where reality thinned and the archetypes bled through. The mother, the warrior, the prophet, the child, each took their role and played it without knowing why. They were participants in a myth older than language, wearing human skin over something more symbolic. Scholars and skeptics would later revisit the incident, not to solve it, but to extract its patterns. The same beings, they claimed, had been seen in the past, in Celtic fairy lore, in the djinn of the desert, in the visitors of abduction tales. The long arms, the glowing eyes, the hovering steps, always appearing at the edges of civilization, never at the centre, always on the threshold. And what is a threshold, if not a question waiting to be asked? Hopkinsville was the edge, geographically, spiritually, emotionally, a rural liminality, a place where industry meets memory, where modernity never fully settled. And so the visitors came, not to conquer, but to test, to knock on the walls of the psyche and see who answered. And what they found was fear, not evil, just fear, the most primal mirror. Because what if the goblins are not monsters at all? What if they are catalysts? Their presence does not destroy, it reveals. It peels back layers. It makes visible the invisible frameworks we use to hold our reality in place. And when those frameworks crack, the light that leaks through is not alien. It is us, all of us, magnified and made unbearable. That is why they didn't need to break in. Their power lay in being seen, and in what that sight awakened. For the Suttons, the days after the encounter were harder than the night itself. Not because anything returned, but because nothing did. The silence after the rupture was more terrible than the event, because now they knew something could come, something outside time, outside reason, outside defense, and once you know that, you cannot unknow it. Lucky took to the woods, building traps for things that no longer came. Billy Ray stopped talking altogether. The children began drawing strange shapes, not learned but remembered. The family had become haunted, not by ghosts but by recognition, as if they'd looked through a crack in the sky and seen not a creature, but themselves. Naked, symbolic, mythic. And what does a myth do when made conscious? It does not disappear, it deepens. The goblins then were not an answer, they were a door, and Hopkinsville, for one brief night, stepped through it. But the thing about doors is that once opened, they do not always close behind you. Some remain ajar, even if only a crack, whispering across the thresholds of dreams and memory. And in Hopkinsville, long after the newspapers moved on, and the porch was patched and the stories denied, that crack remained. Not in the sky, but in the soul of the place. The town, outwardly, returned to its rhythms. Fields were tilled, sermons preached, birthdays celebrated, but beneath the surface, a change had occurred. An unspoken awareness had seeded itself, a tension that lived in glances, in sudden silences, in the careful way people told jokes about little green men without laughing too hard. Everyone knew where the Sutton farm was, even if no one wanted to drive past it after dusk, and in that silence, stories grew, not just of goblins but of strange lights in the woods, of time slipping in strange pockets along the gravel roads, of radios crackling with voices in no known tongue, of children who woke in the night and spoke of figures at the window, not frightening but still, watching. The incident became less about fact and more about atmosphere, less a story, more a feeling, something felt in the chest when the stars were too bright, or the wind paused too long between gusts, a presence that needed no name, only attention. And what is attention, if not a kind of invitation? In folklore, doors often appear at moments of transition, between night and day, youth and age, ignorance and knowledge. To step through one is to become something else, but to encounter a door and refuse to open it, that too changes you. It marks you with what you almost became. That's what happened in Hopkinsville. They stepped through for a moment, and in doing so, learned too much. Because behind that door was not an alien world, but a deeper layer of this one. A realm where meaning is fluid, where watchers observe, not from malice but necessity, where myth is not fiction, but infrastructure. In that world, fear is not weakness, it is initiation. The goblins came not as destroyers, but as heralds. Heralds of a different kind of seeing, a sight unclouded by story, a sight that pierces masks. And perhaps that was the most unbearable part, not that the beings saw them, but that the beings saw through them. Past the surface civility, past the roles and rituals, past the myth of control that holds small towns like scaffolding. That is the danger of being truly witnessed. It leaves no place to hide. In the years that followed, many tried to frame the event in simpler terms. Mass hysteria, group delusion, rural theatre, but these explanations ring hollow when held against the depth of the thing. They explain the noise but not the silence, the shapes but not the atmosphere, the facts but not the wound, because the wound was real and it was shared, not just by the Suttons, but by the land itself. And in that wound, something ancient stirred, a memory older than the farm, older than the town, older than the country that claimed the soil. A memory of watchers who come not to answer, but to remind, not to change fate, but to illuminate it. And sometimes illumination feels like terror, because to be illuminated is not simply to be enlightened, it is to be stripped of shadow. And what are we without our shadows? What remains when the myth of privacy dissolves? That was the riddle left behind in Hopkinsville. Not a mystery of aliens or strange creatures, but of ourselves, of how we flinch when the veil is lifted, even slightly, from the face of our reality. In the early weeks after the event, one could feel it in the air, a stillness that hadn't existed before. Radios were turned down. Gossip lost its flavour. People walked with heads lowered, not out of shame but reverence, or fear mistaken for reverence. The kind of quiet that comes after something sacred has been desecrated, or perhaps made sacred by force. Not everyone admitted it aloud, but they had seen something, or rather, they had felt it, a thinning, a vibration, a murmur beneath the structure of things. The incident had not only shaken belief, it had made belief irrelevant, because this was no longer about belief. It was about memory, not personal memory, but the ancestral kind. The kind that lives in the marrow, the kind that hears a knock at the window and recalls, without knowing why, stories whispered in childhood. Stories of creatures who come not to eat or kill, but to remind us what we are. In the local churches, the sermons shifted. Fire and brimstone gave way to parables of angels and watchers, of testing and visitation, not warnings of damnation, but of discernment. The kind of spiritual preparation one undertakes when they suspect the veil between worlds is thinning again, because the town had changed, not visibly. No banners were raised, no rituals declared, but inside the people, something had reconfigured. A new kind of listening had taken hold, even among skeptics, even among the proud. Doors were double locked not just for safety, but for containment, as if to keep something inside. And maybe that's the truth. Maybe what the goblins awakened was not something foreign at all, but something long buried, a sensitivity, a permeability, the ability to see what the modern world trains us to unsee, the architecture behind perception, the scaffolding of the soul. In the months after, strange dreams were reported quietly, without seeking attention. Dreams of circular rooms, metallic air, and languages made of light. Dreams that did not frighten but stayed persistent, like ink that never quite fades from the page. Others spoke less, grew withdrawn, not out of trauma, but protection, as if language itself was too crude a tool to hold what they had experienced. They didn't want to define it, they wanted to preserve it, like a sacred wound, and perhaps this too was part of the illumination, that the thing which came was not there to destroy belief, but to transform it, to burn away its false edges, to reveal what lies beneath the story we tell ourselves about who we are, because every myth begins as a rupture, a tear in the world through which truth leaks, and in Hopkinsville, that leak had stained the soil. It had entered the water, the wind, the silence between words, and once something like that enters, it does not leave. It waits, patient, unblinking, not for a second chance to appear, but for a second chance to be understood. But understanding is a rare and dangerous thing. It does not come with answers, it comes with dismantling. To understand what happened in Hopkinsville would mean unbuilding the scaffolding of certainty, brick by careful brick. It would mean accepting that the world is not made of facts and walls, but of thresholds, and thresholds once crossed do not allow retreat. So when researchers came, they did not seek understanding. They sought control, clipboards, interviews, photographs, charts. They wanted data, not meaning. They wanted to seal the wound with language, as if naming the phenomenon could tame it, as if measurements could undo the visitation. But the goblins, or whatever the phenomenon truly was, had never spoken in the language of science. They had spoken in symbol, in presence, in the eerie precision of silence, and symbols do not yield to diagrams. They refuse interpretation unless approached with reverence, and the Suttons, for all their confusion and fear, had at least responded with awe, with the kind of primal attention that myth demands. But the visitors in suits brought only dissection, and the mystery recoiled. What no one told the researchers, or perhaps what no one dared say, was that the beings hadn't simply come and gone. They had nested, not in the barn or the attic, but in the narrative. The story itself had become inhabited, and a story once inhabited lives a life of its own. Neighbours began retelling the events, not with skepticism, but with additions. A second farmhouse had heard tapping at their windows. A boy on the edge of town dreamed of silver beings reaching toward him. An old woman saw lights moving beneath the soil. None of these accounts could be proven. None could be disproven either, and that's what made it dangerous. Because once myth enters a place, it spreads like fire underground. You cannot see it, but you feel the heat rising. You sense that something is no longer quite right. even if everything looks the same. The townsfolk began avoiding the Sutton property, not out of fear of beings, but fear of implication, as if to visit the land would be to agree, to consent to a version of reality that made them vulnerable, not to danger, but to awakening. And many were not ready for that, because awakening has a cost. It asks you to live in uncertainty, to admit that you may never be the protagonist of your own story, that you might just be a witness. And the goblins, more than anything, were witnesses. Their gaze did not penetrate flesh, it penetrated narrative. They arrived not to alter the story, but to illuminate its hidden structure. And for a brief moment, Hopkinsville saw it. The raw scaffolding of myth exposed. The sacred geometry beneath their routines. The invisible threads tying fear to memory, memory to symbol, symbol to truth. But truth, once glimpsed, must be reckoned with, and most chose not to, so the researchers left. The story was filed, footnoted, and dismissed, but the threshold remained. And in that small Kentucky town, beneath the rustle of cornstalks and the hum of cicadas, the silence still listens, still watches, still waits, because not all watchers wear faces, and not all messages arrive with sound. Sometimes the most profound communication is what remains unsaid, what curls in the corners of ordinary life, shaping breath, posture, thought. In Hopkinsville, the silence became its own entity, a presence that didn't move, but shaped movement, that didn't speak, but rearranged language from within. The Suttons stopped speaking about the event altogether, not from fear, but fatigue. They had passed through the outer edge of meaning, and what lay beyond it had no appetite for words. The story had been told, then misused, then mythologized, but the myth had not died. It had simply gone to ground, buried like a seed beneath the surface of culture. And in this buried place it began to change, because myth, once made conscious, does not remain static. It mutates, reconfigures, mirrors the needs of the era. And as decades passed, the Goblins of Hopkinsville ceased to be a singular event. They became an archetype. They began to appear everywhere, not in form but in function, eyes at the edge of sleep. Dreams where something stands in the doorway, not entering, not leaving. Feelings of being watched not by something malicious but vast, too vast to fit into human categories. The goblins had become part of the landscape of the unknown, a symbol for whatever it is that hovers at the threshold of understanding, demanding reverence but not explanation. In this way, they joined a lineage, the Fae of the old world, the Jinn of desert winds, the Greys of abduction lore. Different names, same function, same mirror, and what they reflect is not the sky, it is us, our thresholds, our denials, our longing for meaning dressed in just enough mystery to preserve wonder. For some, this shift brought clarity. The goblins were no longer terrifying, they were initiators, signs that the world is more layered than we're told. That reality is a skin stretched over something fluid, living, watching, something that cannot be charted, only encountered. But for others, the transformation of the myth was a second trauma, because to let go of the terror is to confront what the terror concealed. The self. Not the self of daily roles and chores, but the deeper self, the dreaming self, the self that remembers things you've never been told. That knows fear not as danger, but as invitation. The goblins had come to invite. But invitations, once ignored, ferment. And in some corners of Hopkinsville, that fermentation soured into paranoia. Conspiracy theories bloomed like mold. New sightings were whispered, not in awe, but accusation. The watchers became suspects. The mystery became threat, and once again, the mirror was misread. Because what we see in the watchers depends on what we fear within ourselves. Some see monsters, others see gods, but they are neither. They are thresholds, and thresholds only become monsters when we try to slam them shut. That is the legacy of the Hopkinsville Goblins. Not an invasion, not a hoax, not even an encounter, but a question that won't resolve. A mirror that keeps reflecting, even when no one is looking. Because someone is always looking. Not with malice, not with warmth, just with presence, an unceasing attention that neither condemns nor forgives. It is the gaze that legends are built upon, the slow, unsettling awareness that we are never truly alone. And in Hopkinsville, that gaze became a stain on the landscape, invisible but indelible, like ash pressed into the grain of wood, long after the fire. Years passed and the world changed. Satellites mapped the skies, televisions blinked into every room, and the idea of being watched shifted from the sacred to the mundane. Surveillance became ordinary, privacy turned mythic, but the watchers from that summer night, they belonged to neither age. They were not mechanical, they were not human. They were something else entirely, something liminal, something that watched without needing to understand. And perhaps that's what made them so unbearable. Humans can endure many things, even horror, so long as it fits within a story. But to be seen without context, to be known without narrative, to be watched by something that neither speaks nor reacts, that is a kind of spiritual vertigo. It shakes loose the scaffolding of the ego, and in that vertigo, the Suttons were not alone, because over time, the watchers began to appear in other places, not as beings, but as a presence, a residue, encounters that echoed the original myth, but took new shapes. Lights above desert roads, figures in bedroom corners, silent beings who arrived in sleep and left no trace but transformation. The details changed, but the atmosphere remained, that same thick, breathless stillness, that same wordless communion, that same rupture, and from these ruptures, something curious began to grow. Not answers, but art, not proof, but poetry, musicians, painters, mystics, all drawn to the same raw material. The goblins, like all great symbols, became vessels, and through them people poured their longing, their fear, their awe. The encounter became metaphor, not diminished, but expanded, and that may have been the point all along, because a symbol, once born, lives forever, and the Hopkinsville goblins were never just a case. They were a birth, a new pattern inscribed into the human mythos, one that says, you are not at the center, but you are seen. You are not in control, but you are not forgotten. You are part of a story too vast to know, but one that knows you. That's why the silence lingered, why the story refused to die, why decades later, artists and seekers still return to that house, that night, that unnameable feeling, because someone is always looking, and if someone is always looking, then perhaps our lives are not meaningless. Perhaps the watchers do not come to judge, but to bear witness, to hold the sacred thread that ties the personal to the cosmic, the mundane to the mythic, the child hiding behind the sofa to the starless eye at the window, because every time the story is told, the crack widens. Not in fear, but in invitation. An invitation to look back, to see ourselves not through the lens of logic or legend, but through something older, something that watches not to explain, but to remember. And what it remembers is not the event, but the echo, not the shapes that walked through the fields, but the silence that followed. In this kind of memory, chronology dissolves. Time is a spiral, the past and future blur like smoke over water. And in Hopkinsville, what remains is not a moment, but a resonance, something that continues to ring out in the deep well of the collective unconscious. There are those who say the goblins never existed, that the family invented the story, that hysteria turned into folklore, that the night was just a fluke, a misfire of imagination, a shared delusion triggered by stress. But that's the thing about symbols. They do not need to be factual to be real. They do not obey the logic of measurement. They obey the logic of myth, of dream, of soul, and dreams have their own kind of truth. The Suttons in time faded from the spotlight. Their lives stretched on in the slow, quiet erosion that follows disruption. The children grew up. Some left, some stayed. The house passed through hands, the story calcified, But behind the public tale, behind the headlines and documentaries and late-night jokes, the deeper current flowed on, unbroken, because the house itself remembered. It was never just wood and nails. It was a vessel, a container of the event, and like all sacred places, it was changed by contact. The air around it thickened, birds grew quiet near it, clocks ticked differently, not because of radiation or energy fields, but because meaning had rooted itself in the soil, and meaning once rooted draws things. Not people, not always, but patterns, visitors of the non-physical kind, whispered synchronicities, sudden insights, a chill that wasn't cold, a sense of being observed. Not with threat, but with patience, and those who felt it began to return. Not tourists, not thrill seekers, but pilgrims, writers, dreamers, sensitives, people who had never seen the goblins, but had felt their archetype rising in the quiet hours of their lives. They came not for proof, but for connection, not to be convinced, but to remember something they could not name. And many did. They stood in the tall grass beneath a moonless sky and wept without knowing why, because somewhere in the silence, something answered, not in words, not in light, but in a sudden stillness that felt like a hand on the back, like being seen without judgment, like being remembered not as a body, but as a story. And perhaps that's what the Watchers are. Story keepers, not messengers from elsewhere, but curators of meaning, custodians of the mythic threads we've forgotten how to trace. Because we've been here before, in caves, in forests, around fires, telling stories of the beings that came in the dark. Not to harm, but to remind us that we are not alone, that our stories matter. That memory is not only personal, it is planetary. And somewhere beyond the veil, something is holding it for us. Perhaps that's all the Watchers ever were, not invaders, not illusions, but archivists of meaning. Not alien in the sense of distance, but in the sense of perspective. They come not from elsewhere, but from elsewhen. They are not bound by time the way we are. They keep stories we have forgotten to honour, stories buried under the noise of modernity, waiting to be remembered in symbols, in patterns, in silence. In the decades since Hopkinsville, science has reached farther into the stars. Telescopes have stared into the origins of the universe. Satellites have mapped the curvature of space, but still, no explanation has come for the Watchers that appeared in a small Kentucky field. Still, no equation accounts for presence. No formula explains the feeling of being known without words. Because the Watchers do not speak in data, they speak in myth, and myth is the oldest form of memory. It speaks in dreams, in rituals, in the shapes we draw again and again without knowing why. It speaks through the child who sees eyes at the window, through the adult who weeps in the night, for reasons they cannot explain. It speaks through the artist who paints unknowable symbols, the musician who hears music in silence, the stranger who turns their head because something, somewhere, is calling. And always, the calling is the same. Remember, not the facts, those are fragile, not the names, those are fleeting, remember the feeling. The moment before language, the pause before certainty. That is where they dwell. In Hopkinsville, this memory lives in the landscape. It clings to the trees. It rides the wind that rushes across the empty fields at night. It hums beneath the floorboards of a house that should have forgotten but hasn't. And sometimes, just before sleep, someone in that town will feel it. That hum, that silence, that pull. It does not frighten, it waits, and in that waiting, a new kind of remembering is born. A remembering that is not about events, but about resonance, not about details, but about echoes. The goblins were never just creatures, they were carriers, conductors. Their presence was a tuning fork that struck the deep unconscious and awakened something that had long been asleep. And now that it is awake, it whispers. To those who are listening, it says, your story matters, even the parts you hide, especially those, because the Watchers do not care about power or proof, or pride. They care about pattern, and in every life there is a pattern, a curve of myth rising and falling, a hero's journey unnoticed, a grief that mirrors a cosmic ache, a love that reshapes the world. These are the stories they archive, not in books, but in beings, and perhaps the greatest truth hidden in the Hopkinsville encounter is this: we are not observed from afar, we are carried by something vast, quiet and tender, something that holds the sacred thread of every forgotten tale. And if the tales are forgotten, it is not because they cease to matter, it is because we cease to look. In the rhythm of daily life, in the buzz of machines and the weight of survival, the old stories grow quiet, but they do not die. They nest in the subconscious, hidden in lullabies, in the architecture of our dreams, in the shiver that precedes a revelation. They wait for moments when the veil thins, when terror cracks the mind wide enough for memory to flood through. That is what happened in Hopkinsville. Not a visitation, but a remembering. Not an intrusion, but an awakening. Because what the Suttons experienced was not simply strange, it was sacred. The beings they saw, the terror they felt, the silence that followed, these were not accidents, they were rituals. Unintended, unconscious, and utterly transformative. The goblins did not come with purpose in the way we understand it. Their purpose was mythic, symbolic, alchemical. They were the catalyst, and in their wake, something ancient stirred. A thread that had once stretched through every village, every forest, every firelit story. A thread braided by ancestors and kept alive by dreams. It is this thread that the Watchers hold. Not because they created it, but because they remember its shape, because they recognize when a story is about to fracture, and they arrive like silent surgeons, splitting the skin of reality to reveal what still pulses beneath. And beneath Hopkinsville, it pulsed, in the dirt, in the sky, in the blood. Not a monster, not a spacecraft, but a memory, immense, shapeless, holy. The Suttons were never meant to understand, they were meant to feel, to break, to be changed, and change they did. Even in silence, even in denial, even in fear. Because once the sacred thread touches a life, it leaves a mark. You may forget the story, but the story will not forget you. That's why the event refused to stay contained. Why it resurfaced in books, in films, in the dreams of those who had never heard of it. The goblins as figures are curious, too small, too strange, too theatrical, but that is the point. Their oddness is camouflage. Their absurdity is armor, because the truth they carry is unbearable when naked. It must be clothed in myth. Just as ancient gods arrived as animals, storms, flames, so too do these beings come in forms we can almost dismiss. Until we can't. Until the story haunts us not with terror, but with recognition. Because on some level we know, we have seen them before, not in fields, but in mirrors. Not in the sky, but in our longing. We are the forgotten tale they are here to remember. Our grief, our doubt, our search for meaning. These are the relics they protect, not from ruin, but from erasure. Because what matters most is not that they came. It is that we still speak of them, still dream them, still tremble when the night is too quiet. That is how you know a myth is alive. Not when it answers questions, but when it keeps asking them. And the Hopkinsville story has never stopped asking. It asks not only what we saw, but who we were when we saw it. It asks what we fear, what we believe, what we are willing to discard in order to feel safe. But most of all, it asks this: what if the myth is not about the beings at all? What if it is about the threshold we crossed in their presence, and what we left behind when we came back? Because a threshold, once passed, cannot be undone. It is not like a doorway you can shut. It is a transformation, a shedding, and somewhere between the first gunshot and the last fading light in the trees, the people in that house shed something. Not innocence. It was never that simple. They shed certainty. They shed the illusion that the world made sense, that the borders of reality were fixed and polite. The goblins shattered politeness. They tore a hole not in the sky, but in the script. The script that tells us what is real and what is not. Who we are and who we aren't. What belongs in the daylight and what must be banished to dream. And once the script is torn, even a little, everything becomes possible and dangerous. This is why the story haunts, because we sense its implications. Not that we are being visited, but that the veil is thinner than we thought. That maybe we are not alone, not just in the universe, but in our own minds. That the self is not a fortress, but a crossroads. That identity is not a fact, but a ritual, and the ritual was interrupted, and in that interruption, we glimpsed something. Not answers, not even clarity, but depth, an unsettling ancient depth, the kind our ancestors built temples for, the kind we drown in dreams. This is the paradox of the Watchers. They come with silence and leave us speechless. They give no message, yet leave meaning in their wake, like smoke in an empty room. And when we try to name them, goblin, alien, fae, trickster, they shift. They vanish into metaphor. They refuse capture because they are not the story. They are the question that reveals the story. And what Hopkinsville reveals is this, that the thing we fear most is not the unknown. It is what the unknown awakens in us. It is the shaking of the structure, the tremble of the narrative. The moment we realize the map is not the territory and never was. And once we know that, we cannot unknow it. We cannot go back to sleep, even if we try, even if we laugh at the goblins, dismiss the tale, pave over the place, the echo remains. And in that echo is a challenge, not to prove, not to believe, but to listen, to feel the breath behind the myth, to sense the intelligence in the silence, and to ask with reverence, what am I, now that the Watchers have seen me? You are not who you were. That is the quiet truth behind every encounter with the mythic. You return changed, even if you cannot explain how, because the Watchers do not simply observe, they activate. They hold up a mirror, but not one of reflection, a mirror of recursion, of descent, of layers peeled back, until all that remains is the shape of your soul pressed against the veil of the cosmos. The Suttons would never fully answer that question. Neither would the researchers, the believers, the skeptics, or the artists, because the question was never meant to be answered. It was meant to be lived, to echo forward, to become a wound that doesn't close, not because it's painful, but because it's open. And in that opening, a kind of light lives. Not illumination in the ordinary sense, not knowledge, but awareness, a gentle humming awareness that there is more to this life, more to this world, more to the weave of being. The Watchers were never strangers. They were the part of us we keep exiled. The mythic self, the dreaming self, the one that remembers before memory, speaks without words, believes without proof. The one that knows silence is not emptiness, but presence. And perhaps that is the final paradox. We waited for them to return, but they never left. They were never out there. They are in the threshold itself, in the moments between waking and sleep, in the breath between question and answer, in the quiet astonishment of being alive in a world we do not understand. Hopkinsville, in the end, is not a town. It is a symbol, a point of contact between the known and the unknowable. It is a scar in the fabric of reality, and all scars are records of survival. And so we carry it forward, in retellings, in dreams, in the shiver that comes when the sky looks a little too quiet. We carry it because the story is not done, because the Watchers are not done, because we, the storytellers, the listeners, the keepers of echo, are not done. The myth will return, as it always does, in new forms, in new places, but it will still be asking the same thing. Will you listen? Will you remember? Will you look back when something without a name looks through you? The night the sky broke open was not an end, it was a beginning, not of a new world, but of a deeper seeing, not of fear, but of reverence, not of answers, but of questions that remake the soul. And if you've come this far, you already know. The Watchers were never just watching. They were waiting for us to watch back. Thank you for walking this long and haunted path with me, through shadow, silence, and sky. The tale of the Hopkinsville Goblins is not just a story of visitors from beyond, but a myth of the inner frontier, the place where wonder and terror become one. If you feel this story stirred something ancient in you, I invite you to journey with me again. Subscribe, listen, remember. The myth continues, and so do we.